Morning. My name is Kevin Shivers. I'm the Executive State Director of the National Federation of Independent Business. We're a small business advocacy organization with 14,000 small and independent business members here in Pennsylvania. Wanted to welcome all of you to this panel on litigating for liberty. And Judge Napolitano last night so eloquently articulated the attack that's being waged on our personal and economic liberties. And we're honored today to be joined by three distinguished legal scholars who will help us dive a little bit deeper into this subject. And so joining us is Jordan Lawrence, Senior Counsel with the Alliance Defending Freedom. We have David Osborne, who's the President and General Counsel of the Fairness Center here in Pennsylvania. And then we have Randy Wenger, who is Chief Counsel of the Independence Law Center here in Pennsylvania for the Family Institute, correct?
Yes. Yay, Randy.
Well, gentlemen, welcome, and thank you for being a part of this presentation. And perhaps we can start off by talking about what your organizations are doing to combat the encroachment on our personal and our economic liberties. And Jordan, why don't we start with you?
Well, I'm Jordan Lawrence. I work for Alliance Defending Freedom. It is a life, pro-family, religious liberty group. We deal with marriage, with life, and with religious liberty. I work out of our Washington, D.C. office. The main headquarters is in Arizona, and we've been involved in a number of Supreme Court cases. The Little Sisters of the Poor case is actually 7 cases. 2 of them are ADF cases, and then we're arguing a case in October about whether Missouri can single out churches and deny them these grants to buy playground surfaces made out of recycled tires. So that'll be one you'll be hearing about in the next few months.
David.
Well, thanks to PLC and Kevin for moderating the panel. Thanks especially to Loman. And I'm a big fan of these guys, so this is really fun for me to be up here. Pennsylvania has a problem with public sector unions. For those of you who are native to Pennsylvania, you've seen it. Unions run the show over at the General Assembly. So we're focused, the Fairness Center is focused on solving the problem of public sector unionism here in Pennsylvania. We do that by representing typically a public sector employee against his union. Unions are often in the business of squelching personal freedoms, even for those that they represent.
And I'm Randy Wenger with the Independence Law Center. And our law center is involved largely in religious liberty and life issues. And for those economic conservatives in the audience who have no interest in anything that may be religious liberty oriented, I'd like to be able to explain at some point this morning how religious liberties is kind of a firewall that protects all the rest of our liberties, including our economic liberties. Because if government can force people to violate their most deeply held convictions, there's really no meaningful stopping government. So among the cases that we've been involved with, and this one in conjunction with the Alliance Defending Freedom, was the Conestoga Wood case representing the Hahn family, plain Mennonite family from Lancaster County who had a problem with the Obamacare mandate of providing certain drugs and devices that could result in an abortion. And as a pro-life family, they just couldn't provide these drugs. And thankfully, we got that before the Supreme Court in a win that shows that religious liberty is alive and well in the 21st century.
And that is something that we have in common with our organizations, Randy. NFIB, as most people know, were involved in the other Obamacare case that went before the court, NFIB versus Sebelius, in which we argued that the Congress cannot force us to do something just because we exist. And perhaps if any of you can just talk about, that was the one signature, I thought, piece to the decision by the court that we actually won, that the Roberts Court held that Congress's ability under the Commerce Clause to force us, to compel us to do something is limited. Unfortunately, they also decide that Congress's ability to tax is unlimited, which is the reason why we're still dealing with the madness of the federal healthcare law. But maybe if and one of the three of you could talk about the impact of that decision in the Commerce Clause.
Well, I think you're right to identify that as very important. And if I could just explain something, and maybe many of you are very familiar with this, the expansion of federal government in the 1930s, when the court had a majority of Roosevelt appointees, came from distortions of two parts of the Constitution. And so if you understand this, you'll understand quite a bit of the last 70 or 80 years. One of them was the expansion of the Commerce Clause. So rather than regulating commerce between states, it became if you move, it became like 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon. You can anything that affects commerce, which like everything is, that means we can regulate that. And I'll come back to that in a moment, because you're thinking, what's the other one? And that was the separation of the spending authority from the limitations in Article 1, Section 8. So before, up until the 1930s, Congress could spend money, I mean, this is a bit of an oversimplification, but basically on what was in Article 1, Section 8, the enumerated powers. So they separated that and said, well, there's enumerated powers, but you can basically spend money on anything. And so that's why if you saw the New York Times this morning, the federal government is thinking about penalizing North Carolina for passing a law that basically says local units of government have to have anti-discrimination laws that are in conformance with what the state is banning. They can't go beyond that, and now they're saying, okay, well, you're going to lose your highway funds because of that. And that's a distortion of the spending authority that comes from the Roosevelt days. Now, what you're referring to, was there something good that came out of the first Obamacare case? Did my ears? Yes. Now, it got overshadowed by the fact that John Roberts, who my opinion is he's generally been very good. He's not like Justice Kennedy, but this was his big major goof up where he said the taxing power was what legitimated Obamacare. It was a legitimate exercise of that power, which I don't think is right. But what he did say was that it clearly was not a legitimate exercise under the Commerce Clause, which was a huge thing that got totally drowned out by the taxation part of his decision. And I think that that's been sort of an unused thing that other people can come and challenge federal government regulations as beyond the scope of Congress's power under the Commerce Clause.
I remember being briefed by one of our NFIB's attorneys that were taking this case before the court. And I asked the question, I said, man, do you feel like you're under pressure? I mean, here you are going before the highest court. This is the president's signature policy initiative. I mean, don't you, what are you thinking about when you go before the court and you make that argument that this is unconstitutional? And the lawyer came back to me and said, actually, I have the easy job, because all I'm arguing is that the Constitution says what is written. The hard part is for the plaintiff, the other folks who are trying to say that the Constitution actually means something else that isn't written there in the words. And, one of those you walk away moments where you're like, boy, I really want to think about going to law school again. That is awesome. But I'd like to talk to you guys over the last 8 years. And, well, actually, if you take a step back, I mean, since Ronald Reagan, every president has increased the size and scope of the federal government. Probably this administration over the last 8 years, we have seen an increase in the size and scope of government that rivals what we just referred to with the, with the administrations under FDR and all of that expansion. But I guess my question to you is, with this expansion of government, I mean, what's the benefit, Ben? What do we have to show for it?
I can show you some harms. Nobody was jumping up to talk about the benefit, but when you get government that's bigger, government is going to meddle in more things. And that invariably happens. So the beauty of the Reagan Revolution was pushing some of those things back, but that encroachment has come, and that encroachment has come in bigger and bigger ways. So we see, within business, how much of the cost in running business is compliance because of the overregulation. But we see that also in the personal realm, in the realm that matters a lot to the people that we work with on a significant basis. Like, if the government is coming in and telling you that you need to be a wedding waiter for a wedding that you feel like is an abomination because you think your marriage is between a man and a woman, and now you're being told, no, you have to do something you disagree with. Well, now the government's coming in and treating people like they're enemies of humanity, using Justice Scalia's words in one of the same-sex marriage opinions. So the growth in government has resulted in government coming in more places and more controversial places and treating more and more people like enemies of the state. And if we're going to push back government, we need to be pushing back in all areas in the ways that you are, David, in the way that Jordan and I are, because this is a multifaceted problem.
If I can comment just on something that Randy is saying there, is that if there's a question in your mind rising like, but these wedding providers, and I represented the New Mexico photographer, that was my case, the Elaine Huguenin, Elaine photography case. You know, that when there's market failure or when the government, needs to step in and do something, I think that was a legitimate thing if you're talking about state law sanctioned segregation on the basis of race in the South. But when you have a situation like in New Mexico and about every other state where 99 out of 100 photographers will photograph the same-sex couple, what is the point in persecuting and making a public example of the one who won't? Won't the marketplace? Because they're basically saying, my beliefs are so strong that I'm willing to give up a paying customer, risk litigation, et cetera, et cetera. I want to punish you for not taking photos of how good would those photos have been. And we had people volunteering to photograph those kinds of ceremonies, the same-sex ceremonies, for free. Well, then to me, it seems like the marketplace resolves it rather than kind of this stern hand of the government coming in and punishing people for doing that. So that's why I just want to agree with you that the expansion of government, the expansion of these concepts, then basically erodes freedom in places where the marketplace or private mediating organizations could deal with these kinds of situations.
I have to point out that the expansion of government, federal and state, has everything to do with the problem of public sector unions. Mm-hmm. Public sector unions, when they sit down to the bargaining table, they want more positions, they want more pay. We've got to pay for that. And what they want, what they urge through the back door, is that the government would grow and grow and grow, do more things, get more involved in your life.
Now, 2009, 2010, I would argue a watershed moment because that was the time we had a newly elected president, a Democrat. There was a Democrat-controlled Congress. Right. But yet there were a number of these very liberal, progressive agenda items that the Congress, even the Congress, was controlled by the Democrats. They couldn't even enact into law. You think the card check legislation that would enable an individual or empower the unions to be able to bully individuals into signing authorization cards in which to start a union, or requiring employers to hang posters in their places of business, in the break rooms, with step-by-step instructions for employees on how to organize a union. So in effect, you were making the employers a union organizer in their own companies. But some of these crazy initiatives, the waters of the United States, making a puddle in your backyard a navigable waterway. I mean, all of these were ideas that you would have thought with a Democrat governor or a Democrat president, a Democrat Senate, a Democrat House, they'd be able to enact them, and they didn't. They couldn't even get the votes. But a funny thing happened in 08 and 09 is that the president then used his executive authority by executive fiat, started empowering agencies to start legislating through the regulatory process. And, you know, I know the Fairness Institute has been involved in a lot of these types of encroachments. Wanted to maybe talk about the expansion, the use of these regulatory and executive fiats to carry out what the Constitution says is the express authority of Congress.
Yeah, this has been a great tool for President Obama. It's also been a great tool for Governor Wolf. He models himself after Obama. When you don't have to get the legislature involved, there's a whole lot you can do. Unfortunately, that has a lot of really bad consequences, even if you like the executive order. One of the cases that we have been litigating is against Governor Wolf, who issued an executive order to unionize the industry known as the home care industry. Home care workers are those who stay at home to care for someone who is elderly or disabled. Governor Wolf and the unions who've paid for his campaign saw an opportunity to unionize a new industry and then take more money in dues. So he drafted an executive order that said, well, from now on, a union can come in and represent these folks, notwithstanding the fact that they're not really public employees, and they're not really private employees either. They're sort of paid by the government, but employed by individuals. We filed an action against that, and right now have an injunction to stop something about $8 to $10 million in dues to go into a union every year.
And, you know, let's take a moment to really, you know, just kind of dissect that order. I mean, you may have a loved one who you're caring for at home, whether they have some type of a long-term disability, whether you're providing palliative care, you know, they're dying. But, you know, maybe a loved one, a daughter, family member, someone, a friend,
Grandma,
even a
right.
neighbor who's caring for that individual, and, you know, you're receiving compensation from the government to, you know, to help offset those costs of you providing that care. But unbeknownst to you, you now are becoming a unionized employee.
Sure.
You know, to take care of grandma, to take care of a mother, a family
Unionized
member.
against your grandma, by the way.
That's exactly right. And so what happens then is that now the union can actually claim a piece of the payment that is being distributed to you for the care that you're providing to that loved one. Is that correct?
That's right, yeah. So the man that we represent two men. One is a quadriplegic, disabled gentleman. He's been cared for 25 years by one of his best friends. And it's the job is so intimate. If you've ever cared for a loved one in this way, it requires Dawn, the caretaker, to come in halfway through the night and turn Dave over in his bed, or else he'll develop bed sores. That's not a job that calls for instance, this is what the union might advocate for: paid time off, vacation, breaks. This is a 24/7 job. And worse, the union would actually have the authority to bargain against the person for whom they're caring. So that person has a fixed amount of money they can spend. They usually get that money through Medicaid. And to require even greater salary or benefits takes that money right out of the pockets of folks who need it most.
So is this just based on the fact that it's government payment? I mean, if there's just a grandma being taken care of the family, could they unionize that if it's a totally private transaction?
They could and they have, but it's done under a separate. It's done under a separate statute, under the federal statutes. This one would be a whole new brand of unionization. That's part of the problem.
And probably under these federal, there's no legislation. It's just like an NLRB or I don't know, some bureaucrat's interpretation of a federal law.
The NLRB is one of the biggest problems. We'll get back to the federal stuff. I mean, Obama has been able to, he's like Wolf, very much interested in what unions have to tell him. He's been very interested in expanding the ability of unions to forcibly unionize. One rule, I know you're interested in this, that they got through very quickly, the NLRB, was what they call quickie elections. For a little while, an election took a certain period of time. It's never really firmly established, but the NLRB passed a rule to make those elections very fast. So if you're a private employer, you can get sort of ambushed by the union. And the faster an election happens, the more likely it is that the union's already marshaled up the support and that they're going to win. The NLRB's been a very powerful tool.
Yeah, and recently there was a case involving a teacher who sued because they were being forced. They didn't want to be a part of the union, and they were yet forced to pay that fair share fee for the privilege of being represented by that union. What's gone on with that decision?
You're mentioning the Friedrichs?
That's correct.
Yeah, the Friedrichs case is case basically out of California that sought to overturn longstanding precedent in the United States Supreme Court. That longstanding precedent says that even if someone doesn't want to be part of a union, they have to surrender a certain amount of money to a union for the, like you maybe the privilege of being represented, whether or not they want it. That case went all the way to the Supreme Court, and this demonstrates the importance of Scalia's passing. Everyone expected that decision would be a 5-4 decision in favor of freedom, in favor of employees who do not want to surrender their money to a union. And because Scalia died, what we had instead was a 4-4 decision rendered just a couple weeks ago, and that basically means no change. The ruling below was affirmed.
Now, Randy, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Can I just, this may be too much constitutional geekism, but since we have an expert here, I want to say what I know and then have you fill in so there was a 1977 decision that Friedrichs was trying to overturn called the Bood, and it basically divided the world of union dues into two parts. That there was the political, and this is the way whether you agree with this or not, and this is what was being attacked, was that there was just the clear-cut political advocacy, lobbying, paying, endorsing candidates, giving money, and they said you can't force unwilling government employees to pay for that, but you can have them pay for their collective bargaining because they're free riders if they get the increased wages and the better vacation time, and they haven't paid any dues. So the attack in Friedrichs was on this second half and saying that, and can you just explain that? Can you explain that? Maybe I should ask that.
I can, yeah. Yeah, the basic argument that was raised in Friedrichs is what probably all of you are thinking, especially any of you who've served on school boards. Higher wages for teachers, benefits, paid time off, all of that stuff has a political impact.
Right.
It prevents you as a school board maybe from doing other things with your money. It prevents cities and municipalities from providing things that even liberals would like. Well, what the Friedrichs litigant said was there's no distinction between political and non-political. If you're going to be spending money, if you're going to be making decisions in your government, it's all political. So someone who's forced to surrender money so that a union can further those goals is in fact being made to surrender their money toward politics. It's a gross misunderstanding that I think liberals all over the world share. They sort of think that there are political issues, and then there are just, these are good things that we do. Real lack of understanding that people like you, and I would say Randy and Jordan, you meet them even more than I do. People have opinions that they need to be shielded from the government. Mm-hmm. The government is trying to tell people what to do, and they're trying to do it as if this weren't a political nightmare for people.
Now, Randy, you've argued before the Supreme Court, and we talked a little bit about the death of Antonin Scalia, Justice Scalia, and its impact already. But maybe if you could, from your perspective, offer what you think the short-term and long-term impacts are of the death of Scalia with some of these really important cases before the court today.
Well, we expected that there would be a lot of 5-4 decisions coming up this term and in the terms to come, which are now, at best, 4-4 decisions. And that's a tricky outcome, because with a 4-4 decision, who wins? Well, whoever won down below wins. Mm-hmm. What if there's similar...
And it sets no precedent, if you just understand that. It's the lower court wins, but it doesn't set any precedent.
Right. And so there have been some cases with regulating abortion clinics around the country that have gone different ways in different circuits. One of them recently went up to the U.S. Supreme Court. If there's a 4-4 decision there, well, it means those who won below continue to win, and those who lose below continue to lose. And so there's no resolution. It's going to take a ninth justice to resolve this, but the catch is, what kind of justice? Are we going to find somebody like Justice Scalia, again, who was such a he was such a deep thinker, but the thing that made his legacy so powerful was that he firmly believed that we are a nation of laws and not of men. And while everyone will give lip service to the Constitution, his understanding was that the Constitution meant something, and meant something originally, and that's the objective meaning to continue to take with us now. If we can make it mean whatever we want to in our modern age, it effectively ceases to have meaning. And rather than just looking quickly to get a ninth justice for political reasons, we need to be careful to get somebody who actually upholds the Constitution that they swear to uphold.
Now, when you made arguments before the court, did Justice Scalia challenge or ask questions of you as part of your presentation?
Well, to be clear, I didn't actually argue the case. It was Paul Clement. But yes, he's one of those amazing amazing figures on the court, because I mean, the Supreme Court justices are arguing amongst each other as they ask questions of the attorneys. It's really questions that they're jabbing each other with. But Justice Scalia could ask those deep and probing questions that others would have a very, very hard time with. And that's not as if the other conservative justices don't do that as well. But his absence was certainly clear the last time I sat and watched an argument.
Now, on those 4-4 cases that you mentioned, when there's a circuit split, is that a better opportunity to get re-argument?
It depends what we do with this, right? In the past, some significant cases have been pushed for re-argument in another term, and I think there's reason for justices to look at some of these high-level issues that are honestly going to take re-argument at some point in the future and just say, look, we're going to hold off an opinion rather than do something that's temporary. But whether they'll follow that course of action this time, I'm not prophetic.
And what type of clear direction does it leave the rest of us with, right? Because whatever the decision that might be coming up from the Ninth Circuit versus, the DC Circuit versus wherever. I mean, as constitutional attorneys and scholars, how do you find your direction from that?
Yeah, it's you take it on a case by case basis, and right. That there is some time of uncertainty, but I feel that it's not like shutting down the government. The Supreme Court has existed. In fact, if people are old enough to remember down their history, that there was, during the Nixon administration, there was a period of time where the Supreme Court had only 8 justices, and I think at some point had 7 for over a year. It was 390 some days that they had, because basically the Democrat-controlled Senate didn't like the candidates that were being sent up by Nixon. Oh, fine, sounds familiar.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and so I think what's really important about this, it's not and if I can just say this, it is not a dereliction of duty of the Senate to do nothing. The Article 2, and I think it's Section 2, says the president nominates, and with the advice and consent of the Senate, appoints, ambassadors and all this sort of stuff like that. So what it means is the president has the sole power to name the person, but it's a joint power of the president, well, I guess it's the Senate, then to approve the person so they get the seat. And there's been plenty of times in the past where the Senate has just refused to act on an ambassador nominee or something like that. And I just think it is gallingly hypocritical for people like Joe Biden, who would not bring people up for a vote that were mainly lower court judges because they were too conservative, and then pretend like all of a sudden he has this Damascus Road conversion where he's renouncing his speech, this speech he gave a couple of weeks ago, where he said A in 1992, and now he's saying non-A, but I really meant A when I say. I mean, it's just a bunch of baloney. And now the thing is that it is rank hypocrisy, but it's also politics. But politics are supposed to enter in. The reality is that Scalia leaving, the court has been kind of generally on this razor balance between conservative, or I would say, interpret the Constitution according to its original meaning versus view it as a blank check for courts to do whatever they want, with Kennedy mainly deciding which way that they went. So this isn't just, oh, we have a vacant slot, we have to fill it, so like a car needs, all its cylinders working. That's not what, it will shift ideologically. Even though Merrick Garland's a wonderful guy and all that, he's not a conservative. He's going to shift the balance of the court. And I think it's absolutely appropriate under the Constitution and the right decision for the Senate to say no hearings, and now they're beginning to say, and I think this is appropriate too, until we see who gets elected. Because if we have President Cruz, I want him to fill that slot. If we have President Hillary with a Democratic Senate, maybe Merrick Garland isn't such a bad, he's, better than what we're going to get with Hillary, somebody who's 20 years younger and a lot more radical.
Well, when you're talking about, Judge Napolitano last night, he talked about the fourth branch of government, that being the bureaucracy, right? And we've talked here in this panel about just the explosion in the growth, the size and the scope of this federal bureaucracy. And I know NFIB has a new president and CEO, Juanita Dugan, and I can tell you what's keeping her up at night is this nomination and the confirmation process of Judge Garland, because we've had to do battle with Judge Garland, the small business community, before the Washington, D.C. Circuit on a number of cases where, again, this administration, through executive fiat, is compelling small employers and taxpayers to do things because they couldn't get it through Congress. So by regulation, this administration, whether it's the Environmental Protection Agency, whether it's the National Labor Relations Board, whether it's the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, or any other agency, they have been proposing regulations that have been going before the D.C. Circuit, because that's where all federal agency regulations are challenged and considered before they go to the Supreme Court. What's concerning is that in every one of those cases, Judge Garland has sided with the bureaucracy.
Right.
And I just, for all of you, you've had experience in a lot of these cases. What can you tell us about Judge Garland and maybe not his philosophy, but what does the record show about his decision?
Well, I think that what you just said is the most important thing, is that this is basically all legitimate. Whether it's an EPA regulation, just to point out, this is so widespread. I just want to emphasize, because I just think that's probably the most important thing that was been said in this panel, is what you just said. The EPA does not say backyard puddles are navigable waters. That's a bureaucratic regulatory interpretation. The Obamacare Act does not say everybody's got to pay for abortifacients and contraceptive. It is a regulatory interpretation. And then the NLRB, what was the one you were, was it about there's some NLRB things that are not really in the act, but it's just a regulation that they've come up with. And that all of this is basically because Congress says all this stuff, all the details are too difficult. If we got into the weeds and had to pass actual regulation saying you can do this with the water or this with Obamacare or whatever, that'd be too much. So what we're going to do is just not give the blank check of power to the courts. We're going to give it to the bureaucrats that we haven't elected. There's no real view. And then they have this Chevron doctrine that basically says we defer to their interpretations. And I think that that's the big threat, is, and kind of like, it's just sort of this dark matter in the universe of the Constitution that people are saying, why are we allowing all of this to function? Because even if people said, if you get the argument, well, look, Congress can never understand the details needed to, get, actual pollution out of the water or whatever, then I would say, if that's actually true, that a modern society can't regulate on that basis, then let's have a constitutional amendment that we can actually discuss and not just have courts waving their hands and the magic wands to make this be constitutional law and legitimize it that way.
We used to think that the Constitution said Congress shall make the laws, and now we've just thrown that to the side.
Right.
Well, if we can't get it done, we can always do it over here, with just a real frustration.
The biggest impact really is on folks that you represent. It's on small business owners. many of the big businesses are all in favor of regulation. The reason is more regulation, well, they've got enough lawyers to pay for it. They can operate in a way that weaves and bobs around those regulations. They have the relationships with the regulators. It's the new entrants to the market that have the most problem lawyering up, restructuring their businesses. Many of you guys have faced this firsthand. It takes a lot of time and effort to set up a business.
Yeah, sure. The analysis that NFIB has conducted, the cost of complying with regulations for a small employer, 40% more than they are for a large company. And it makes sense because in a large company, you've got a law, you got lawyers that work in there. There's, you probably have some regulatory compliance officer, or maybe even a whole office full of those people. There's a whole suite of HR managers and others to manage all of these rules. In that small business, it's the employer. So the time that the employer is spending looking at the Federal Register, trying to figure out all of those regulations, and then sitting there trying to figure out how those regulations impact them, and then reaching out to their attorneys or their accountants or others to say, how do I comply? That's less, the time that they spend doing all of those things, that's time they're not spending going out and selling their business to find new customers or to perfect a product or a service that they're delivering. So there really is a significant cost to those businesses, smaller companies by this size and scope. And we are very concerned. I mean, there's a number of key regulations that are coming down the pike. I mean, we're watching with interest, all of us as taxpayers, on this decision in the Friedrichs case because of the fair share fee and what that costs all of us as taxpayers. But, some of the others, the navigable waterways issue is significant. The joint employer rule through the NLRB is another significant case. This Clean Power Plan, which is going to, it's the agencies carrying out, the EPA carrying out the president's war on coal to, force any generator of electricity who uses coal or any other type of fossil fuel to generate that power, we're going to eliminate that, and so we're going to jack up electricity prices through the roof, and so all of those have small employers very concerned. And I did want to note to our audience here in the room and those on PCN that if NFIB is compiling the record of Judge Garland, we're going to be putting it up on our website shortly. If you go to nfib.com, you can stay tuned there, and you'll be able to find these and a host of other cases that we've been tracking in terms of his record on economic liberty, if you will, or personal liberty. Another area of the law that we really don't talk about, we don't really think about when we're talking about personal liberty or economic liberty, is the access to the courts, right? Because at the end of the day, there are disagreements that need to be resolved in the courts. And one of the concerns that small businesses have is this notion that our day in court, that access to the court to resolve some of these differences, is being denied because the courts are being clogged with frivolous lawsuits, and even clogged, quite honestly, with all of these appeals of this government overreach. And this lawsuit abuse, these frivolous lawsuits, have a significant impact on our economy. About $105 billion a year is spent just on tort liability alone in this country. Really significant. For a typical small business, it costs $100,000 to defend yourself on a claim, regardless of whether you're liable.
Right.
So as a result, most small business people say, I just want to settle this and get it out of the way, or their insurance company will do that.
Right.
To the tune of $35 billion a year is being spent by small employers in this country just to make cases go away so that they don't get thrown out of business. And as we talk about the courts and we talk about litigating for liberty, clearly this is lawsuit abuse is a significant impact on our liberty. Wanted to hear your thoughts on that as lawyers about maybe what we can do to help improve that process.
Well, I just want to start out by saying none of the lawsuits filed by any of us fit that category.
That's correct. No, and that's an important point. We're talking about redress. We're trying to preserve the liberties that are being, infringed upon by the government. What these frivolous lawsuits are about are when personal injury lawyers or someone, the lawsuit over the hot coffee, or,
Right.
you just made me feel bad. There's actually a new line of theory now that they're exploring, and it is the loss of chance of recovery. And so the idea is that a doctor gives you a 40% chance of a successful outcome. But you find a medical expert that comes in and says, you know what? If that doctor diagnosed you sooner, or if that doctor designed a better treatment plan, that would have been a 60% chance of recovery. So in other words, we're now going to sue based on the fact that one doctor gave you a 40% chance of recovery, but that chance of recovery could have been better because of a whole other series of thoughts. And now you think about that. What's the impact going to be for that? Well, first, if I'm a doctor, I'm not going to give you odds. The second thing is if you come to me and you've got a cold, I'm going to, schedule you for a colonoscopy. I'm going to do blood work because God forbid you have something growing in you and I didn't figure that out. I mean, that's the cost of the litigation industry.
Well, I mean, this underscores the importance of the judiciary. Lawyers are always going to be jerks. I mean, I can complain about them all day, but they'll only keep litigating those kinds of cases if they see results, or a chance of results.
Right.
And judges are the ones who allow those things to happen, the ones who give frivolous lawsuits a shot.
I think part of the issue, too, is the legislature and the laws that we create in the first place. So you go back, peel away the decades, and go backwards, and we had a society that could figure out how to function without as much government and without as many laws. The increase in the number of laws that then give a club in the hand of litigants is part of the problem that we're facing, where we need to push back against laws like that in order to effectuate people's religious liberty, because of the laws that we've created that are taking those things away. So we need to be careful to not think that the solution to every problem out there is more laws.
I think that's right. I mean, the one thing that I would add is, and I just want to say I'm no expert on, but I feel like you've had state Supreme Court striking down tort limitations. I don't know if it's happened in this state, but that type of thing doesn't put any, if you're knocking down sensible limits. I mean, one of the things, too, that we've seen and I know this is not exactly at the heart of your question, but these employers or business owners that get sued for discrimination, they can't even get into court, and they go before these, for some reason, and I don't quite know why this happened, they usually go before administrative tribunals that are stacked with people that are trying to root out all forms of discrimination. And if you're accused and you're a business owner, you must be all the stereotypes are there, and you must be guilty, and that sort of thing. And it's very, very hard to bring defenses in those kinds of environments like that. And so I think the spreading of the laws, everybody's a victim, there's got to be a solution, just sue, is a mindset that we also have to get out of the culture.
David?
Yeah, I think the culture is the real problem. That's what Jordan's getting to. So instead of hammering out differences with maybe a church leader, maybe with a trusted friend, we run to the courts too quickly.
Now, we've talked, we spent a good deal of time talking about the balance of power at the federal level on the courts. Here at the state level, there was a watershed election last year, and the balance of power in our state Supreme Court was 4-3. Now the balance of power in that court is 6-1. We just had a resignation, which has turned the tide on the court. What are your thoughts? I mean, what's the roadmap look like for those that are liberty-loving individuals in their state courts?
We've got an interesting state court system because we have popular elections for everything. And not only that, judges select a party when they run. So you've got judges running as Republicans and Democrats. You know, those labels are not very descriptive of what we might call a judicial conservative or a liberal. And some of those splits are honestly, we don't exactly know what the split is right now. So the decisions will tell us. But what this underscores is that it's important, notwithstanding the confusion, notwithstanding the labels, it's important that we try to figure out who's conservative and who's liberal. And basically what I mean by that is a conservative judge might believe that words have meaning. Whether it's a constitution, whether it's a statute, these things can be applied with regularity, and they can be applied in a fair, relatively objective manner. And a liberal might say, well, I can use words to my advantage, and it can mean whatever as a judge I want it to mean.
In the few minutes that we have, or 2 minutes that we have left, Randy, if maybe we could all talk about how folks can learn more about what you guys are doing. Can you give us a website where people can go to learn more about what you do?
Sure. Folks can find us at independencelawcenter.org, and there's a list of some of the cases that we've been involved in and how you can get involved to help. We are a pro bono law center, so if you or somebody you know is having an issue, a religious liberty type issue, we would love to hear about it and be able to help out in any way that we can.
Fairnesscenter.org. You can also give us a call at 844-293-1001. Typically, we represent public employees, but we do it on a pro bono basis because people like what we do and has the need for excellence and representation for people.
You know, and you're making me think, too, that I just want you to realize that even if you're saying, oh, I've got a problem, but it doesn't really fit in one of these categories, and please call these guys if you do. There's plenty of property rights groups and small business-oriented defense groups that provide their lawyers for free. And if you, don't know, who do I call up or whatever, and you don't know, what I would do is you could call one of us or call up the Heritage Foundation, talk to their legal department. They're probably one of the best, or the Federalist Society, that have a really wide understanding of who's out there to lead you to the right place. If you got religious liberty, life, defense of family and marriage, Alliance Defense Fund, Alliance Defending Freedom, which is adflegal.org.
And you can always learn more about what NFIB is doing by visiting nfib.com/Pennsylvania. You know, the last thought for all of you, again, politics it's not a spectator sport. You know, this judicial nomination, this confirmation process, this matters. And it's up to all of you to do your homework, do the research about the nominee, but to communicate your views to your United States senators, let them know where you stand. So on behalf of Dave Osborne, Randy Wenger, Jordan Lawrence, thank you very much. Great program.
Thank you.
Thank you guys.
Thank you. Thank you.